Hi, I'm Valerie Schutte, and today I'm going to talk to you about Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is perhaps the least studied of the wives of Henry VIII, for both the brevity of her queenship, 6 months, and the few duties she performed as queen, possibly never even consummating her marriage. However, Anne was able to peaceably navigate a divorce from a husband who split his country from the Catholic Church to divorce his first wife, and later executed his second wife. Anne became one of the wealthiest women in England, courtesy of her divorce settlement, and managed to live out her life in England as the king's sister and as a friend and confidant of Mary I. She stayed out of court politics, yet remained friendly with her ex-husband, to the point that many European monarchs expected that the two would remarry upon the execution of Catherine Howard. Anne also outlived all of Henry's other wives, and is the only to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Contrary to the popular poem, "Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived," Anne of Cleves should be considered the queen who survived. Anne deserves consideration for the agency that she was able to attain as a divorced queen and single woman. Anna von Jülich-Cleves-Berg was born on either 28 June or 22 September 1515 to Maria of Jülich-Berg and John II, Duke of Cleves. Anne had one older sister, Sibylla, and two younger siblings, William and Amelia. Anne and her sisters were primarily raised by their mother and given little education beyond how to run a household. She was taught how to sew, finances, how to cook, and basic reading and writing. Anne's parents were both Catholic, and her mother remained so until her death. Anne's father, however, was a friend of Desiderius Erasmus and began to follow his humanist ideas of Catholic reform, yet never became a Lutheran. With this atmosphere of Catholic reform, and with Anne living with her mother until she was an adult, it is likely that Anne was a Catholic throughout her lifetime, even though her sister Sibylla and her husband were supporters of Martin Luther. Anne was betrothed to Francis, son of Anton, Duke of Lorraine, in 1527. Francis was also son of the nephew of Karl, Duke of Gelders. The Duke had no direct heir, yet Anne's father, John III, was a claimant. With the betrothal, a settlement was made that John would pass his claim on to Anne, and the Duke of Gelders would declare Francis of Lorraine his heir if Anne and Francis married. The marriage contract was signed on 5 June 1527, but there was no ceremony to cement the betrothal. Karl, Duke of Gelders, died on 30 June 1538, and William, Anne's brother, was created Duke of Gelders in his place. Charles V also had a claim to the Dukedom of Gelders and started a many-year quarrel with William over the land and title. Anne's own betrothal had been predicated on her claim to the Duchy of Gelders through her father and Francis of Lorraine, her betrothed, becoming Duke of Gelders. With William's claim, this meant that Anne could not marry Francis, or William would have to give up that title. So by mid-1538, Anne was available on the marriage market again, just as Cromwell began pursuing a marriage match with Cleves for Henry. After more than a year of negotiations, the final marriage treaty between Henry and Anne was signed by Henry VIII's commissioners on 4 October 1539. All that was left to settle was how Anne would get to England. Anne could either travel to England overland to Calais and then sail across the Channel, or sail the entire way. The land route was safer, but this required permission from Charles V for her to cross his territories. And this was not a given, since William and Charles were disputing over Gelders. The Cleves envoy in England insisted that Anne travel overland, as she had never been on the sea before, and they worried for both a rough journey and the possibility that she would catch a cold or disease. Henry finally agreed to the land route. Anne was expected to arrive in London by Christmas, yet Anne and her attendants did not leave Dusseldorf for England, until 26 November. When she did leave finally, Anne's train was very slow-moving and frequently was delayed, rarely progressing more than 5 miles per day. By the time she arrived in Calais, she could not leave for nearly 2 weeks because of bad weather. During her 2-week stay in Calais, she attended banquets and jousts, met with some of Henry's most trusted advisors and friends, and learned English card games. With Anne spending so much time with many of Henry's friends, it is not unreasonable to think that she used her time wisely to prepare herself to be Queen of England. She attempted to learn English card games and English supper manners, so it is likely that while doing so, she attempted to learn as much English as possible and press Henry's comrades for information about her new husband, court, and country, for all reports of her were full of praise. Anne finally departed for England on 27 December 1539. The rest, as they say, is history. Anne arrived at Rochester on New Year's Eve, expecting to spend the night there, before eventually arriving in London for 3 January to meet Henry. Yet Henry could no longer wait to meet his new bride, and rushed to Rochester to see her in person on New Year's Day. That day, Anne was watching bull baiting with some German lords. Henry came to her with 10 or 12 attendants dressed as private persons, not of nobles of the court. Anne invited Henry to dine with her, assuming he was another representative of the king. They dined, and Henry stayed the night, though separate from Anne so as not to damage her virtue, and left the next morning after breakfast. It is not known when Henry revealed himself to Anne as the king. It was not until the next day, when Henry left Rochester for Greenwich, that he immediately began to talk of his displeasure of Anne's appearance, and asked Thomas Cromwell to find a way out. In fact, he left in such a hurry and so displeased that he did not give Anne her New Year's gift of sable furs. Instead, he gave them to Anthony Browne to give to her, marveling at all of the reports that had been written that flattered her, claiming they were falsely written. Despite Henry's protests, it was too late for the wedding to be canceled, and Anne continued her journey to London. Anne left Rochester on 2 January, and the next day was received at Blackheath Hill, just outside Greenwich. There, Henry waited in a pavilion for her, where Anne finally met the king's daughters, Margaret Douglas and Lady Frances Brandon. Her route was lined with spectators, and the Thames was lined with barges trying to see the new queen. Henry rode out to greet her, and then escorted her to Greenwich for a day of feasting and celebrations. Their wedding proceeded on 6 January 1540. The morning after their wedding, Henry reported to Cromwell that he was unable to consummate the marriage because she was physically unattractive and not a virgin. So while it is recorded that Henry did not enjoy his wedding night because Anne had a flabby body and saggy breasts, it is unlikely that Anne enjoyed Henry's fumblings to determine this. Henry continued to be unable to consummate the marriage after his wedding night, and he consulted with his doctor, who advised him not to exert himself by trying too hard. Yet Henry may have refused to consummate the marriage intentionally, and voiced this to Cromwell and his doctor to be recorded as a way to be released from the marriage later. In public, however, Henry presented Anne with gifts of jewels and pearls and made plans for tournaments in her honor. In public, Henry made all appearances that he was content with his new bride. Yet in private, he vocalized his concerns. Anne, however, embraced her new role as queen and attempted to fit into the English court. Yet the royal couple was at Westminster for the opening of the third session of Parliament on 12 April, and one of the acts entered on the Parliament roll was the dissolution of Henry's marriage to Anne. Another act entered was an act of attainder against Thomas Cromwell as a traitor. It was at the same time that Henry began giving Catherine Howard gifts. On 19 June, an act of attainder was passed against Thomas Cromwell and found him guilty with no trial. After Cromwell's downfall, Anne was sent to Richmond to retire, under the guise that there was plague in London. Henry, however, stayed in London, where he visited with Catherine Howard in the evenings. On 6 July, Anne was informed by a messenger from Henry that her consent was needed for an inquiry into the validity of their marriage that was to be made by clergy. The convocation of clergy took 3 days to find Anne and Henry's marriage invalid, based on her previous pre-contract with Francis of Lorraine, on Henry's lack of consent and their lack of consummation. Anne was never called to give witness or even allowed to see any documentation provided to the convocation. a parliamentary statement was released that invalidated the marriage. Henry gave Anne a generous settlement as part of their annulment, likely in thanks for not challenging him and making the process much more difficult, as it had been with Catherine of Aragon. She was allowed to keep her jewels and dresses, hangings, furniture, plate, and would be given money for her household. Her role as sister to the king would give her precedence over all ladies at court except Mary and Elizabeth. As early as October 1540, there were rumors of Henry taking Anne back as his wife. Yet these very much increased immediately following the downfall of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, in November 1541 for adultery. William, Anne's brother, pressed for Henry to remarry Anne. When he heard of Catherine's downfall, he instructed Cleves ambassador Olesleger to write to Thomas Cranmer and the Privy Seal on the subject, but neither Cranmer nor the Privy Seal wanted to get involved, seeing as that Cromwell had died for his involvement. The European interest in Henry and Anne remarrying speaks to Anne's importance as an international queen. In December 1541, at the same time as Catherine Howard's affairs were revealed to Henry, Richard Taverner repeated a rumor that Anne had recently given birth to a son, whom she conceived with Henry during a visit to Hampton Court. While this rumor circulated after Anne had recently been bedridden with a stomach sickness, and not because those around her wished Henry to remarry her, it did nothing to dispel the possibility that Henry would remarry Anne because she had given him another male heir. Henry went so far as to have the rumor investigated. The council interrogated some members of Anne's household, but not Anne, and determined that all of this was false. It seems kind of ridiculous that Henry had this investigated at all, as he claimed he never slept with Anne when they were married. For her to have given birth to his son in December, that means they would have had to have sex early in the year when he was still very much in love with Catherine Howard. Possibly he had it investigated to see if she really had a baby by someone else. In a letter dated 25 February 1542 by Eustace Chapuis, ambassador to England to Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Chapuis finally dismissed the prospect of their remarriage as very unlikely. However, the possibility of Anne's reinstatement as queen only became more sensationalized with the publication of l'oration et remonstrance des hautes et puissantes dames de Marie de Cleves, allegedly written by or produced for Anne of Cleves. L'oration explicates the marriage of Henry and Anne, though the name Marie actually erroneously refers to Anne's mother's name in the title. This mistake, which was not corrected until 1561, must have cleared Anne of involvement in its production, for it is unlikely that she would have not used her own name. On 26 January 1542, only 18 months after Anne and Henry's divorce, William Paget, who served in several political and diplomatic positions under Henry VIII, Edward, and Mary, wrote a letter to Henry that mentioned an oration defending Anne of Cleves against Henry's repudiation of her. Paget also sent a copy of the oration to Henry and asked if he should complain to the French king regarding its existence and try to discover the author. 1 month later, Paget wrote to the Privy Council that he had since spoken with King Francis about the book, so it needed to be determined if she had any involvement. Paget also wrote a separate letter to Henry after his meeting with Francis and noted that the Privy Council was concerned about the book and had written to him to discover more about it and the people involved in its creation. Paget then discovered that it was written by the abbot of Ervy, Jean de Luxembourg, later Bishop of Pamiers in France. Paget reported that in the meeting with Francis, he asked Francis to suppress the book, yet the king acted as though he had never heard of it. Francis promised Paget that he would suppress the printing and order copies to be destroyed, and also suggested that the Duke of Cleves could not have given his blessing to the book because Anne was still young and of childbearing age, so he would not ruin her chances of making another political marriage. Paget assured Francis that Henry had acted according to God's law, so he would not take Anne back. This correspondence suggests that this book was first produced sometime in 1542, probably in direct response to the trial and execution of Catherine Howard. Yet the exact date of its first edition is unknown, and the first extant edition is dated 1547, after the deaths of both Henry and Francis. so perhaps Francis really did suppress the book. After the first mention in 1542, l'oraison was printed in at least 9 editions. French editions appeared in 1547 and 1549, and Italian editions appeared in 1558, 1561, 1562, 1569, 1575, 1584, and 1741. During the half-century immediately following Anne's divorce, and for at least 2 centuries after this oration was passed down in Italian historiography as factual. This fake supplication to Henry VIII, rather than actual biographical information, was represented as Anne's heartfelt desire to remain Henry's wife. In England, while Anne remained popular after her divorce, she faded into relative obscurity after her death. Yet in Italy, she had an afterlife as a slighted woman who only did right by her husband, yet was repudiated anyway. The oration most likely had great appeal because it was written in the form of a personal appeal by Anne and depicted her as grief-stricken by her removal as Henry's wife because she came to him from a foreign land prepared to be his lawful and obedient wife. This Anne professes that she only has love for Henry. She was never pre-contracted in marriage to another, as a pre-contract was one of the reasons used to legitimate their divorce. And she goes on to address Henry's counsel as to why it is God's law for Henry to have repudiated, against God's law for Henry to have repudiated her. While Henry may not have found that portion of the text offensive, he certainly would have considered the rest to be. It declares that Henry sought to marry Anne, so he should maintain his end of the marriage contract. Moreover, Anne knew that Henry had a poor reputation in Europe for being temperamental and brusque, yet Anne defended his previous actions and agreed to marry him anyway. For Luxembourg, what is most egregious is that Anne willingly entered into marriage with Henry, yet did not commit any wrongdoings against her husband, and married Henry with good intentions, yet Henry repudiated her, thereby breaking her heart and showing himself to have weak morals. Now, what are Anne's options as a divorced woman living in a foreign country, relying on the goodwill of her former husband? Luxembourg's Anne concludes by leaving her fate in Henry's hands, reassuring him of her love, and making one final appeal to Henry's privy council to guide him to doing what is right. Rather than focusing on Anne personally, the text is more concerned that Henry has broken the sanctity of marriage. The feelings displayed by the fake Anne in this text reflected reactions of those abroad. Henry repudiated his 4th wife hastily, had a disturbing reputation for acting rashly regarding women. Marriage was a religious act sanctioned by God, and Henry had the opportunity to make things right with his 4th wife and with God by taking Anne back. Luxembourg's oration about Anne of Cleves had an enduring appeal that kept Anne relevant and made her an example for Roman Catholic Europe to show the extent of Henry VIII's immoral and heretical religious and marital choices. Not only did this oration create and solidify Anne's foreign reputation as a jilted wife who desperately wanted nothing more than to please her former husband, it contributed to Henry's already poor reputation among European Roman Catholics. This does not quite explain why Luxembourg's text was printed 11 times, but it does show that Anne continued to be of interest on the continent as a royal woman in her own right, particularly as the title of the oration always reflected her queenly status, even when she was divorced and demoted to the rank of the king's sister. She was used in this oration to make a political statement regarding Henry VIII and England. Anne largely disappears from court records for the next couple of years. She suffered a brief illness in March 1542. Anne reappears in March 1543 when Chapuis sent reports that Henry invited Anne to Hampton Court Palace, where she stayed for 3 days but only saw Henry once. Princess Mary visited Anne at Richmond Palace in June 1543. Anne was only about 1 year older than Mary, and the two seem to have remained friends during Anne's lifetime. Likely Anne was not relevant to the Tudor court for these 2 years, because she lived on her own with her own income. She was largely self-sufficient and stayed away from court. Additionally, Henry married Catherine Parr on 12 July 1543, so all of his attentions were turned to his new wife. In 1546, After spending some time at court, rumors swirled again that Anne and Henry were having an affair and that she gave birth to his children, who she was hiding abroad. This would have been highly unlikely, as by this time Henry was very sick and probably not even having relations with Catherine Parr, let alone his former wife. Rather, this speaks to Anne's continued importance as an international figure. Yes, this was court gossip, but it also implies that Anne did not lose status or importance as a foreign royal woman in England and was still seen as suitable for having children with the king. Henry VIII died on 28 January 1547. Anne was no longer sister to the king, but former stepmother to the new king, Edward VI. As her former husband was now dead, Anne had much less relevancy to court and to the new king. She was now the divorced widow of the previous king, a position with unknown privilege and power. Under Edward, Anne did have financial struggles. She ended up losing several of the properties she was given as her divorce settlement. Edward died on 6 July 1553. Anne and Mary, Edward's successor, had a much better relationship, so Anne's situation immediately improved under Mary. As Anne and Mary had remained friends, Anne took part in Mary's accession celebrations. The day before her coronation, Mary rode from the Tower to Westminster, and Anne and Princess Elizabeth rode together, immediately behind Mary in the procession. At the banquet after Mary's coronation, Anne and Elizabeth sat at the top table with Mary. These events signaled Anne and Elizabeth as the most important female figures in England behind the new queen. Mary's coronation, however, was the last time Anne was seen in public. By the spring of 1557, Anne was unwell. She took to her bed on 12 July and wrote her will. She died on 16 July 1557 at the age of 41. She was embalmed and laid in state for nearly 3 weeks. Anne was buried on the south side of the high altar at Westminster Abbey, not too far from where Mary and Elizabeth were eventually laid to rest. Her monument is visible on both the high altar, and the back side is also partially visible, with the memoriam, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England, born 1515, died 1557. William of Cleves ordered services to be held in her honor in every church in Cleves. She is the only one of Henry VIII's 6 wives to be buried in Westminster Abbey. Anne of Cleves was the second international bride of Henry VIII. She came with an alliance to German princes who promoted reform and a break from the Catholic Church. She was only queen for 6 months, yet she was able to amicably divorce her husband and maintain a household and several properties. She also remained friendly with Henry, his subsequent wives, and his 2 daughters. She learned English quickly and adapted to her new country, eventually considering it her home. After Henry's death, Anne suffered financial hardships as her properties became too expensive to maintain. But she also navigated this by adjusting her holdings and making rental income. She participated in the coronation of England's first queen regnant and was eventually buried in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of some of England's most important kings and queens. Far from simply being Henry's second divorced wife, she survived her marriage, outlived Henry and his other 5 wives, and maintained a position of prestige within England. Anne was nothing short of the survivor queen.